Do you remember being younger, driving around in the car, how bugs would constantly splatter the windscreen? You'd turn on the windscreen wipers and smear it all around, this insect soup. A small reminder that while your journey was underway, another's had just ended. Well, have you noticed that this doesn't really happen so much anymore? And sure, it might save us some cleaning work, but it's a trend that carries a sinister message. It's one of the signs that we are in the middle of a biodiversity crisis and that some species are suffering more than others. Tonight, I want to tell you about the different survival strategies of 3 different species. First, picture La Reunion Island in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Now, it's a tropical island, so it's hot. You're no doubt guzzling back the fluids and sweating copious volumes by day. But by night, you've gone bush, with a UV lamp and a white sheet. You find the perfect spot and set up your equipment, and pretty soon the bugs start flying in, attracted to that light and landing on the sheet. But you're only interested in the beetles. And more specifically, what you're interested in is these small nematode worms that live under the wings of the beetles in what's called a necrominic association. The worms live in this state of suspended animation, waiting patiently for the beetles to die before they come out and resume their normal development. Now, that relationship, that necrominic association, is pretty interesting in its own right. But what I wanted to know was how these worms were surviving in different habitats across the island. At 63 kilometres long and 45 kilometres wide, Reunion Island is known for its hot coastal beaches, which very rapidly transition into a high-altitude, cold, volcanic interior some 3,000 metres above sea level. So what works well as a survival method for those worms that are chilling out, relaxing down by the beach is not going to cut it for those trying to make a living in the cooler volcanic interior. And it turns out that populations that are separated by just a few kilometres are undergoing changes in their DNA that are enabling their survival in those respective environments. Now, when we typically think about evolution, we think of it as a slow process, small changes over millions of years that ultimately result in the formation of new species. But Reunion Island has only been above sea level for about 3 million years, and it must have taken some time for the beetles and their hitchhiking worms to get there. So what we're seeing in the case of these worms is what we refer to as rapid evolution, whereby swift changes in DNA occur in response to strong environmental pressures to enable those populations of worms to adapt to their different habitats. Okay, that's one survival story down, and time for our second. Now here, things might get a little bit smelly. I want you to picture getting some meat, putting it out in the sun until it gets really ripe. And when it does so, you should notice that the blowflies will start buzzing in. And you'll need to stand by with your insect nets ready to catch them. Now, when we think about blowflies, we tend to think of them as a nuisance, and some species do cause fly strike, feeding on the flesh of sheep and contributing to animal concerns and agricultural issues. But what you might not know is that blowflies also perform lots of important roles for our ecosystems. For example, they decompose things, which means that they also have important forensic applications. And they also pollinate flowers. Luckily for me, they're not too fussy, which means it's pretty easy to bring them into the lab and do experiments on them under controlled conditions. And one of the things that my team and I like to do is pit different species against each other. So, for example, we might take one blowfly species that's found all around the world and compete it against another that's just found in Australasia. And when we do this, a common trend is emerging. We find that the more geographically widespread species outcompetes the less geographically widespread species in a number of different traits. For example, it lays more eggs, it better withstands both heat and cold exposures, and it grows in population size at a faster rate. Now, insects are found on every continent, and they inhabit nearly every terrestrial habitat around the world. And if we go back some 500 million years ago to the Paleozoic, then there's these dragonfly-like fossil creatures that have wingspans of up to 70 centimetres. Now, I bet that dragonfly could travel a fair distance, and I wonder if it may have been quite geographically widespread and competitive as a result. That's 2 stories down, and time for our third. Now I want you to stick with your sense of smell, but this time it's the smell of mothballs, a toxic chemical smell that helps to keep insects away and is important for use in museums. You smell this as you walk down an aisle and pull out a large tray of pinned moth specimens, which you take back to your lab to begin your research. There's no travel to new locations for this story. What we're going to do instead is travel back in time. The particular moth that we're talking about really likes to eat. In fact, its common name is the cotton bollworm because it especially likes to eat cotton. But it's actually able to eat over 350 different types of crops. A common control method has been insecticides, but this moth is cunning. It very rapidly develops insecticide resistance, and then, because it flies really well, spreads this resistance around to all of its mothy friends. Using museum samples that go back over 100 years to a time before insecticides were being used, we can see that key changes in DNA through time are responsible for that rapid development of insecticide resistance. In addition to that, there are also key changes in genes that are important for detoxifying plants, which explains the broad diet breadth of this moth, while other changes in key genes that are responsible for response to temperature, so-called heat shock proteins, explain the fact that this moth can live in a variety of different thermal habitats globally. Being able to survive in a range of different environmental conditions is becoming increasingly important because we're witnessing environmental changes within the spans of our lifetimes. The average global temperature has risen by 1 degree Celsius in the last century. Most of this warming has occurred in the last 40 years, and 7 of the warmest years on record have been in the last decade. And coupled with those types of changes, we're also seeing an increasing frequency of extreme weather events, like heat waves and floods. As these changing environmental conditions continue, differences in the ability of different species to respond to them is going to result in the presence of climate change winners and climate change losers. Tonight, I've told you the stories, the survival strategies of 3 different species. But did you notice any common threads? Well, first, you might have noticed that all 3 species are invasive species, species that move out of their native range and go on to have negative impacts in their new environments on either the environment, the economy, or human health and well-being. Invasive species cost us over $423 billion annually in global management costs, and they've played a key role in the recent extinctions of over 60% of plants and animals. Second, you might have noticed that all 3 species differed in their degree of impact, from not very much in the case of our worms, to moderate agricultural impacts from our blowflies, to more extreme agricultural impacts from our moths. And this reflects the fact that different invasive species differ in their degree of invasiveness and their extent of associated negative impacts. And finally, third, you might have noticed that whatever their impact, all 3 of these species were really good at what they do, whether it was exploiting beetles, winning competitions, or changing their DNA rapidly at a pace that outstrips that common snail pace of evolution. I remember being younger and very confidently proclaiming to my mum that weeds were just very successful plants. And I think she pretty well saw through my excuse to try and get out of gardening work. But it is true that invasive species do tend to be hardier, stronger, faster than their native counterparts. So what can we learn from our patient worms, our competitive blowflies, our hungry caterpillars? Well, on the one hand, if we can gain more insights into the private lives of invasive species, we might be able to find better ways to control them. A nice example of that comes from invasive stoats, which it turns out are strongly attracted to the scent of cats and ferrets. And knowing this, that attraction works as a bit of an Achilles heel for the stoats. If we put out baits that are scented with the smell of cats and ferrets, then the stoats will come running, leading to better trapping success and also less off-target impacts. But invasive species might also have something to teach us about versatility and resilience, about how populations that start off small go on to thrive and flourish in the face of ongoing environmental challenges. And a nice example of that harks back to the moth that we talked about earlier, which is native to Australia but recently made it across to South America, where it mated with a native species. In doing so, it rapidly passed across that gene for insecticide resistance, giving the native species a bit of a boost. Using similar logic, we might be able to apply success stories from invasive species and the lessons associated with them to small populations that are threatened and of conservation concern in order to help them do better in the face of the changes we know are coming. Just like any good story, tonight's story has featured winners and losers. And if native species are the good guys in our story tonight, then invasive species are most certainly the bad guys. But even so, as you leave the venue shortly and get into your cars with their insect soup-free windscreens, it's not the missing insects that I want you to think about, the ones that are no longer splattering our windscreens. Those are almost certainly the native species, the ones that are less adept at adapting to ongoing environmental change and challenges. Instead, what I want you to think about is the invasive species, the bad guys. At their hearts, biological invasions represent extraordinary evolutionary events. Nature's successful experiments showcasing rapid evolution in the face of extreme environmental pressures. And as a result of that, invasive species might just hold the key towards us developing better understanding of how biodiversity will respond and to us coming up with better solutions in the face of the ongoing and wicked problem that is climate change.